I promised you that I was going to show you how to deal with refreshing the tokens, even though in the case of GitHub, that's not needed at all. So let's now create this kind of a refresh method on our GitHub Authenticator, which, if the credentials can be refreshed, is going to be quite useful. So let's scroll all the way down here and create a new method. It's going to return a future, either because it can produce an auth failure, and the correct value which can be returned from here is credentials coming from the OAuth2 package. So these are going to be the newly refreshed credentials. And let's call this refresh. And what does it need to get as parameter? Well, it needs to get a credentials object, credentials, which are gonna be the old credentials which are already expired and in the need of being refreshed. So we're going to refresh these old credentials to produce the newly returned refreshed credentials. It's gonna be asynchronous. And inside of here, we can utilize a method which is directly on the credentials object, which is called refresh. Now, if we take a look at this refresh method, at its documentation, we can see that it throws an argument error if secret is passed without an identifier. And also what's important, it throws a state error if these credentials cannot be refreshed. So in the case of GitHub, it's always going to throw a state error, or it would throw it if we would call the refresh method without any thought. But as you can see up here, we're only going to be calling the refresh method if the credentials can be refreshed. So we know that we are safe from that state error. So we do not need to handle it over in the refresh method. So if we go back there, we can refresh. We need to pass in the client ID and client secret. We don't need to change the scopes. And we can also pass in an HTTP client. So let's just, for good measure, pass in the client which we have defined above for that accept header containing application JSON. So the identifier will be client ID. Then the secret will be client secret. And lastly, HTTP client will be our, well, how it's called actually. It's called GitHub OAuth HTTP client. So let's copy that and let's just pass it here. This refresh method is going to return the new credentials which we obtain, which will contain the refreshed access token. So we want to put this inside final credentials, or refresh credentials for that matter. And now we want to save these refresh credentials inside of our credential storage, because we want the credential storage to always contain the most up-to-date credentials. So let's do await credential storage dot save, and we want to save refreshed credentials. And of course it wouldn't hurt if we actually awaited these credentials, because the refreshing of them is asynchronous since it happens on a server. And if everything goes correctly, we are going to return write refreshed credentials. So what are some of the exceptions which we need to take care of? So firstly, we are dealing with the credentials storage again, so we know that we should catch a platform exception and turn it into a storage auth failure. And then if we take a look at this refresh method again, argument error, state error, which we are not going to handle because they can never occur in our case. And even if errors occur, you should not really be catching them because they are breaking. Exceptions are generally non-breaking, you can get around them, but as for errors, they are usually breaking, and there is just no way to recover from them in your app. That's the general theme of it. Exceptions can be recovered from, errors cannot. However, as you can see, this is not always the case because, for example, DIO throws errors and they can actually be recovered from. It's not really a huge issue when a socket exception happens, for example. So take that with a grain of salt, because especially some third-party libraries like DIO just do not follow the official naming guidelines for errors and exceptions. So just do what you will with that. But when you have an official library and you see an error, you generally do not even want to catch it. But what else can happen here? Well, authorization exception and also format error, but this is really a format exception. Again, this is a typo in the documentation. So we want to catch authorization exception and format exception first. So let's put this inside try, move this all up, then on format exception, we're going to return left const auth failure dot server, and also on authorization exception, like this, we're gonna actually catch it. So catch E, return left again const auth failure dot server, but this time again this exception object contains some useful information. So we are gonna create a string containing interpolated exception object dot error, then colon, and again interpolate the exception object dot description. Whoops, but we now have invalid constant values because we are using the constant constructor, but this exception object which is caught is not in any way, shape or form constant. So we need to remove this const keyword. So, we're gonna lose out on optimization, but losing out on an optimization like constant constructors for a bit of functionality is never a bad trade-off, to be honest. And the last exception we need to catch is platform exception, in which case we're gonna return left auth failure dot storage, and let's make this into a constant constructor call or constant factory call. And now we can call this refresh method from all the way above when we try to get credentials to be used all throughout the app. And if we find out that they can be refreshed and that they are also expired, that's precisely the time we should call refresh and pass in the stored credentials, which, as we know, are expired in this case. Again, this is never going to happen in our app, but it might happen in other apps which use the refresh token. And in this case, we do not want to return the old and expired stored credentials, but instead we are going to await the refreshed credentials, which is actually returning an either type. So let's put this inside final failure or credentials. And now we're going to check for failure or credentials, and we can either do fold, as you've already seen. So in the case of left being populated with a auth failure, we are going to, well, return null, because we want to return either credentials as we're doing over here, or null. If something bad happens, we are just going to take it as if we were unauthenticated. And the auth failure is something bad happening, so we're just gonna return null and pretend that the user is just not authenticated whatsoever. And in the case of the correct value of credentials being present, we're gonna return these new credentials. So when an auth failure happens, we're gonna be unauthenticated, and when the credentials are refreshed successfully, then they are gonna be returned from here. So in such a case, the get signed in credentials is going to return credentials which are newly refreshed.